Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Jonathan Cowest. I'm Chief Executive of LGIU, Local Government Information Unit, and delighted to welcome you all here for another one of LGIU's Ask the Expert sessions. And like all events in this series, this is exclusively for you as LGIU members. For those of you who've perhaps only experienced us through our briefings or our daily news updates, LGIU is one of the UK's biggest independent, well, in fact, the biggest independent local government membership body. We were created by 3 councils in England over 40 years ago, and today your council is one of more than 300 LGIU members across the UK, Ireland, and Australia. Our job is to support local government, and we do that by offering guidance on legislation, on key development, through insight, analysis, shared learning, training, research, and opportunities like this to bring us together with colleagues and dig into some of the challenges that councils around the world are grappling with. And this year we launched a new initiative called our Future Local Lab, which is an evolving program which is designed to help local government internationally to prepare for and respond to emerging issues. And we developed the lab because we think that whatever the sort of global trend, whatever the issue, the drivers, these are all, the impacts are felt in local communities and they're dealt with by local government. And also because many of the issues that local government deals with are shared across the world: housing, AI, aging populations. And so it makes sense to us to share and to disseminate learning around those complex issues. And today's session is about doing just that. So this afternoon or this morning or this evening, depending on where you're joining us from, and do drop a line in the chat to let us know where you're coming from. Today's session is all about exploring the principles, evolution, and origins of urban co-governance, sustainability, and inclusive city development. And we're really lucky to have with us today one of the world's leading experts in this field, Professor Sheila Foster, who is a professor at Columbia University's climate school, but is also the co-creator, the creator and co-developer of the Co-City approach, which she's going to tell us a bit about, which has been adopted in numerous cities around the world, including New York, Amsterdam, Baton Rouge, Hong Kong, Sao Paulo, San Jose. So I'm really excited to hear a little bit about that. But before we begin, a couple of items of housekeeping. We are recording the presentation today, but we'll turn off the recording for the conversation. So that conversation will be Chatham House. We won't be sharing your remarks. We'll have questions after Sheila's run through her presentation. So please feel free to drop questions at any point into the chat, and our events team will sort of collate them and bring them to my attention, and we'll get onto them at when we get to the Q&A. So I think that's more than enough from me. I'm going to hand the virtual microphone over to Sheila so we can hear about her work in this incredibly interesting space. So Sheila, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Good morning, evening, or afternoon to everyone. I'm really happy to share a little bit about the evolution of this framework called the Co-City framework, or the Co-City protocol. And it's all contained in a book, which the title is up here: Co-Cities, Innovative Strategies for Just and Self-Sustainable Communities. Just making sure you can see my screen. Yes, good. Okay. So I want to start a bit about, where this idea comes from, and how my colleague Christian Laione from Italy and I developed this, and then to kind of bring it through to some applications. So just to start that, in the early part of my career, I worked in a field called environmental justice. It's now morphed into climate justice. And I worked in communities like this. This is Camden, New Jersey, that I would say had complex and intersecting challenges, including the list of things here, what we would call blight, a lot of vacancy and abandoned infrastructure, population loss, housing challenges, pollution exposure challenges, poor health outcomes, what we would now call energy insecurity, food insecurity, and today climate impacts and heating. So, and these communities are what we would call overburdened, let's say, with these kinds of challenges. But I also, in working with these communities for many years, realized that they had a number of assets that were underutilized. And, we've heard of the term social capital, the bonds and networks that people have with each other, including networks and organizations. A lot of these communities, although many low income, many minority, had very strong institutions within them and very strong networks. They also had infrastructure that they could use, and existing community facilities, parks, and childcare centers, cultural and historical heritage, and also local entrepreneurs, what I would call social entrepreneurs, as well as artists who were often working on these challenges. What we call in the book active citizenry. And what I also saw is that some of these communities were leveraging these assets. Strong social capital became neighborhood collective action, right? They took the vacant lots and created community gardens. We see this all over the world. We see a lot of this, perhaps even disproportionately in low-income neighborhoods. Uh, you know, this kind of collective action reinforced solidarity and, importantly, created new collective goods, right? What I would call kind of the urban commons, food, safe spaces, recreation space. These gardens are often multi-purpose, in neighborhoods with high levels of crime. Eyes on the street if kids were out here and people were gardening. And then today we know that these same spaces have climate benefits, right? They can mitigate flood, and reduce heat island effects. And they enable communities to function and flourish in a self-sustaining way. And this led me to studying Eleanor Ostrom, right? The Nobel Prize winner, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And she wrote a book called Governing the Commons, and she has a long line of work. And some of her findings were that, communities can govern their shared resources, right? She looked at this in the natural resources context, but found communities all over the world that were, governing fisheries, water systems, especially, she said, in close-knit communities, homogeneous communities. They created rules of use and self-governance around the use of these resources, how much they took out of them, and that those rules were recognized and respected by higher level government, which she called nestedness. And the responsibilities for governance were not just kind of just the communities, they were shared with other public and private actors, right? And that local governments and other kind of local government like entities like water districts were an important part of this. And what I realized from my early research was that, there are many of these examples in the urban environment. So again, I started writing and thinking about the urban commons, right? Co-created and shared constructed common resources within urban communities that were a result of social processes of users coming together, and not just in homogeneous communities, as she found, but often in very diverse communities, right? Heterogeneous communities. And these new forms of urban commons included wireless mesh networks. The famous ones include in Red Hook in Brooklyn here, I'm in New York City. In the UK, there are some, right? Cooperative co-housing, and even today, what we would call community solar. So on the bottom left is Casa Pueblo in Puerto Rico, a very famous, solar and microgrid network in a community. And so I began to think about Ostrom in the city, like that. A lot of her insights apply to the city, including self-constructed communities. I think the most scaled version of this is in some informal communities where they take land that is available, maybe they squat on it, maybe titles transferred, but they literally self-construct these communities. Sorry about that. And this launched what we called the Co-Cities Project with my colleague, Christian Laione, who was also writing about this. And we began to look at, it used to be 100 co-cities, now we're up to over 200, case studies all over the world in different regions of, communities doing this, working in a shared way, co-creating shared resources, often with public and private actors. And we created a database and a website with some of these case studies, and then eventually wrote a book about the insights from these. And some of the insights are what we call design principles that are extracted from the case studies, much like Eleanor Ostrom did. She looked at communities all over the world, and she began to say, what characterizes these efforts, what makes them successful, and why do some of these fail? And so here are some of the principles that we extracted, and I'll just walk through these and then give you some examples of what this looks like on the ground. And the first principle we saw was, or that we extracted from a lot of, is that there were forms of co-governance, collective governance, right, is a feature of many of these institutes. And I think one of the key examples of this now all over the world are community land trusts, right? I know you have them in the UK. They've been flourishing here. Land trusts started in in kind of natural resource environments and to kind of save or to preserve, ecologically sensitive land. They've been used in the urban environment to help keep land and housing and other uses available. They often have a tripartite governing structure here in the US where, the people that are living in the housing on the land are on the board, larger community members, and then other experts, and they're a form of community stewardship. And they share and they hold the resource in perpetuity, right, for future generations. And here we see in the US, we have some really scaled examples of this. This is a very famous example outside of the Boston area in an area called Dudley Street. And what they did in the 1980s is they worked with the city and the state and foundations, and they kind of took control of publicly owned vacant lots and privately owned vacant lots through eminent domain, the state's use of eminent domain in one of the poorest areas. And they placed all this land, what they called an urban village, in a land trust. And they worked to create this urban village of urban housing. They have hundreds of units of affordable housing that have remained affordable over the decades, urban farms, playgrounds, and commercial space. And we also see that when local government really enables this, as we see in New York City, that enabling environments are another aspect of this, is that, these things really flourish when there are institutions and policies and laws usually at the local level that are enabling these experiments. So here in New York City, for instance, the housing department and the city council have set aside millions of dollars a year to help communities plan for land trust. They appointed a land trust coordinator. And so this is important to now what we see. We've gone from a couple of land trusts in New York City to a flourishing of them around the city in a high cost environment. And, this goes to Ostrom's insight that the enabling role can unlock what she called public entrepreneurship. And we see this with the flourishing of land trusts. Often these things are nested in the local government, right? Some of them remain independent, but often they're nested. And one example that we found in Chicago, for instance, is something called Neighbor Space. It's not a community land trust, it's a city land trust. And it's created by 3 local governments, the park agency, the city, and another agency, to preserve the way that users across Chicago in different neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods that lack green space, were using available land and resources to garden and to share them with community members. And the trust operates as a higher level authority that assists the gardeners with permits, with materials. They transfer land to them, they clear title. but they leave the governance, the rules, to the local garden itself, and they require that there be at least 3 leaders, 3 gardens, or 3 gardeners that are setting the rules, and it's not just one person. And so again, they preserved hundreds of these spaces across Chicago in this kind of nested way. Another characteristic we saw are what we call pooling economies. Economists in the urban environment use agglomeration economies, and Mayor Bloomberg famously said that if you attract, the creative class, kind of very talented, educated folks to the city, the businesses would follow. So, and that's been a driver of a lot of urban growth. In the US and other developed economies. But we saw in these examples, pooling economies. That is to say, it's challenging for communities to construct new resources because they're often underinvested or disinvested, as in the communities I was working in. And it's also difficult to do it by themselves, right? To sidestep the state and the market. So often in these examples, that we found all over the world, communities are working with others to pool human capital, resources, and efforts. And so one example is what's emerging here is this community investment trust, where people are pooling their money and they're investing in resources to create common pooled goods that create they're not just stakeholders in their communities. It's really creating shareholdership through local economies. However, this pooling effort, as we write in the book and show through many examples, requires them not to just pool money and land and resources, but to work not just with local governments, but we often see communities working with universities, with other civil society organizations, with private entities and local businesses. And so almost all of these efforts involve some kind of pooling of sectors as well as resources. And another design principle is experimentalism, that these efforts, particularly at scale, require some failing, right? Trying things and failing. And here's one famous experiment, or that became famous, that we launched in Bologna, Italy. Bologna at first was interested in becoming a smart city. They elected a new mayor, and he said, I want to do something else. I want to become like a collaborative city. They worked with us to create this idea of the city as a commons, and through this regulation that they passed, right? The regulation on the collaboration between citizens in the city for the care and the regeneration of the urban commons. And this was a citizen city collaboration that helped activate residents to care for and regenerate resources that range from the piazzas, painting the piazzas, to a housing complex in an immigrant neighborhood, regenerating that. And what we helped do was create neighborhood governance labs where those conversations could take place, where residents came together with the local government. The local government created an office of civic imagination outside of City Hall in the neighborhood. And at the center of the regulation, what were called pacts of collaboration, the pacts that the local government entered into with some constellation of residents and local businesses or civic organizations to take on a regeneration project with resources transferred from the local government to that collective. We went back and we reviewed the first of almost 300 packs, and we found that in some sense, those initial packs were a failure, right? They were pretty low level projects. They weren't really regenerating infrastructure at any scale. They were painting walls. They were kind of cleaning up parks. Very few of them were regenerating infrastructure, turning, kind of vacant or abandoned schools into daycare centers, or housing into, or improving housing or creating housing. And so, and we thought that the processes needed tweaking in Bologna. We have not worked there in many years. I understand that this is, still going on, but I'm not sure whether they tweaked it in ways that we suggested. The other principle that which was surprising to us, was what we call tech justice. That in order to do this in today's age to collaborate, to effectively collaborate, to effectively activate citizens, and to do so in a way that where they're working with local government and others, that they need to have access to technology, right? And that many of these communities, and hence the mesh networks, don't. And so technology can reinforce existing, inequalities and hinder the co-creation of these kind of goods. But it can also serve where it's there as a tool for inclusive governance, participatory decision making, and empower the community. And the rise of wireless networks and others, community-based networks, are an example of this. And let me go into some examples, right? That where I've applied the Co-City approach in the U.S. Here we help to create a community edge cloud network, and what you're showing here is what we call the Co-City cycle, where we were addressing a long-standing lack of broadband access within households in Harlem, even though New York City is a smart city and is a 5G test bed and all that, about 30 to 40% of households in many neighborhoods did not have internet access in the home. And obviously that's very difficult if you're finding a job or doing homework, et cetera, et cetera. And so we applied the Co-City model to this and helped to construct, with the help of Microsoft, which donated the Edge Cloud network, and a civic organization called Silicon Harlem, a broad scale participatory research and technology trials to put in place this community broadband network that was then nested within the smart city infrastructure of the city. And it included a community governance board for that network. So again, here's the model. So the idea here, so those were the design principles, is, this idea that we had is the city as a commons, like using the infrastructure of the city as a common good, to help residents co-create with local government and others, the goods that many of them are often lacking and that often government struggles to provide. It's not a replacement for government. It's not a replacement for public assets, but rather it's a methodology to leverage those assets in ways that deeply involve communities and that help to meet the needs and often to bring their entrepreneurship and their ideas not just to the table, but as a driver to construct these goods and to situate them not as stakeholders but as stewards and shareholders. And it's the idea that we have in the book, and moving from kind of shared governance and community gardens, or kind of a collective action, through collaborative, to ultimately polycentric governance, right? This idea of that there should be many nodes of governance around particularly large complex cities, in which, the local good, so these are nested in local government or connected, but in which, communities have more than a kind of perfunctory role in being stewards of these institutions. And here's the Co-City cycle that I mentioned before. And the way that we found that this happens is, through various steps, including kind of low stakes talking. Cheap talking is a phrase that Eleanor Ostrom used. This idea, it's low stakes talking to bring people together, to map assets, to then begin to practice with community, to begin to build trust, to prototype something like a regulation or land trust or a neighborhood governance lab, and then to test the model like we did in Bologna, and then to give feedback and model, or to improve the model to work more effectively. And here's what we call the Co-City toolkit, right? These are the kind of outcomes that we've seen in our empirical study. How do you finance this? We see social project finance, crowdfunding, bonds and impact investing, co-working spaces, neighborhood labs, obviously digital platforms, public community packs, as in Bologna, urban civic uses, as in Barcelona and other places, land trust, real estate development cooperatives, etc. I just want to end with a project that I'm currently involved in Baton Rouge, what we call Co-City Baton Rouge. And it's a 4-mile area in the city that is what we might call a kind of infrastructure desert. They have many needs from housing to better streets to commercial activity to the need for green space because of climate impacts and flooding and lack of safety. And we've been working with the local government, the Redevelopment Authority, and others down there to transform this area in Plank Road. We came in when they had just finished a plan, and some of the things that the community wanted was to amplify culture and their history. So to preserve the rich African American history in the neighborhood, which goes back to the post-war area, to protect and grow what they called community wealth, and to build streets and neighborhoods that connect people to economic opportunity. So this was the plan that they were developing when we brought in. We won a competition called the Advancing Cities Challenge with a collaborative. Here's LabGov with NYU, my university, True Fund, and others on the ground. And one of the things we did in this area was that we created a new institution called a Community Land Bank and Trust Hybrid, the first in the country. A land bank because there was a lot of vacancy where the title was not clear, and the city's land bank was holding it, and they transferred over 40 lots to this institution to help clear title under the state law and to allow the institution then to use this to build. And to create trust with the community, we wanted to produce something right away and to give them and to show them that this entity can work and that we could deliver for them. And one of the first things we did with the community was to create a competition to co-design what we call is an eco park. And the eco park served many functions. It gave them a safe place for a bus stop, flooding relief, an urban tree canopy for the heat issues. So it's the pocket park up here. The CLBT is also going to be a catalyst for eventually a food hub to address food insecurity in the neighborhood. Here's the drawing of the park that was just built with, again, all the various aspects, bioretention, storm drain, seeding, raised garden beds, et cetera, et cetera. And here's the Co-City cycle that we went through, starting with what we call low stakes talking, having a food truck roundup to learn about localized needs, because a lot of the way the community to sell food out of the food trucks, a mapping of assets, a practicing to decide online. So all this happened during the pandemic because we started working there right beforehand. But a mapping to or a practicing to and then to help them construct a competition, a design competition. Then prototyping, we had a design competition, working with the local university to sketch these out, and then a decision matrix about where to kind of place this new development as well as future development. And so the next phases are grocery store, affordable housing, which we're involved in now, in a civic center. Again, using this land bank and land trust as a way, a community governed institution in which they could play a more than marginal role in, stewarding these assets. Okay, so some takeaways from this model. Um, these kinds of community-driven, co-managed institutions and efforts can be emerged, we found, even in thick urban environments, very heterogeneous urban environments. It's important that they are supported and enabled by public officials or public agencies, as well as working with the private sector and universities and others. They're not just for cities, right? We've seen this work in rural areas, important in the US in particular, because there's a lot of need in rural areas and not a lot of capacity or resources for work. We found that public community or public-private community partnerships and collaborations have a lot of potential, not just for economic growth, but for inclusive growth. And they move us away from a stakeholder society, right, which focuses on just giving communities a seat at the table, to a shareholder one, where even the most vulnerable and marginalized communities can share in the value and wealth that are produced by these partnerships. So I'll end here and thank you for your attention.
Sheila, thank you so much.